we're not going to send boots on the ground. We're not going to send tanks and artillery. We're going to send like a couple guys with a ton of gadgets. This focus on assassination, precision, it's like the Israeli model. All the things that, Hegseth wants, right? Like unleashed brutality, no legal constraints, high-tech, gadgets that don't have to be tested in ways that, we might normally have expected, right? That can sort of be let rip on the battlefield. I don't know whether that is a vision of the future of a military that will be that successful. Because again, what are wars fought for? Why do you want military power in the first place?
Are we heading towards World War III? Or maybe we're already in Cold War II? This interview was recorded before the recent US-Israeli attack on Iran, but that has only made it all the more relevant. For the last few years, inside the US military-industrial complex, there's been a kind of quiet struggle going on. On the one hand, you've got the primes. You know them, you love them. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics. These are the companies that make the big things, mostly, for the US defense sector: planes, missiles, armored personnel carriers, and so on. On the other hand, there are another collection of defense companies. You've got Anduril, Palantir, even SpaceX to some extent. These come out of Silicon Valley, and they pride themselves on their agility, their ability to pivot to the next big thing in war. They say that the primes are bloated and slow and anti-competitive, to the extent that one Palantir executive even said that there were two places in the world that still practiced communism: Cuba and the Department of War. To help me understand all of this, whether or not drones really are the future of warfare, who exactly is playing the part of the Soviet Union in this new Cold War, and whether the US and Israel might be about to succeed or fail in their attacks on Iran, I spoke to Susannah Glickman. She's written widely on the paradoxes of the military-industrial complex, the history of computers, and has even contributed research on the science of quantum algorithms. So, Susannah Glickman. Susannah Glickman, welcome to Do Your Own Research.
Thanks so much for having me.
We've had a lot in the last year or so from particularly Secretary of War Pete Hegseth about needing to pivot the US military back towards increasing lethality and increasing ability to actually fight wars and to dominate the world. And this comes as a kind of challenge to what we think of as the defense primes. We'll get into what those are in a second. These are the massive companies like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, or RTX, it's now known, Boeing, and so on, against their sort of seeming inability to actually fight major wars. The US hasn't won a war for a very long time. So my first question is quite a simple one in some ways, which is just how woke is the F-35?
Yeah. I mean, there was that incredible spate of posts by like Laura Loomer and Elon and all of them about, how woke Lockheed is, which is remarkable. I mean, it shows how much the discourse has moved. But I mean, so that specific question is it's been a fantastic thing as a researcher to see how the changing valence is. But your general question is more about, this new focus on, or like this framing, right, of this conflict that's emerging between the primes and these new defense tech contractors, and Pete Hegseth's own personal interest in, remaking the Defense Department away from sort of its feminized, woke, or, past, which is not exactly what many of us think of when we think of the defense industry, into a much more lethal, unleashed, all these buzzwords, unleashed, lethal, brutal force that's capable of winning wars. And they focused a lot on the technical aspect of that, which is, the prime's inability to provide the right weaponry, and that like the defense tech, the Silicon Valley tech firms would somehow be able to do that better. I think the framing, is a little bit misleading in a bunch of different ways. I mean, I think Pete Hegseth and the way that he talks about the problems in defense, it's the product of like a much, much, much longer history. You know, I'm a historian, so like I'm going to be tempted to take you back to like World War II, but I'm not going to do that here.
There.
I have like a piece coming out on like actually the term lethality and its connections to like ideas of computational efficiency, but whatever. I'm not going to get into that. But I do think Pete Hegseth himself is a product of this two different narratives that come out of the perceived failure of the U.S. in the War on Terror era to like win Afghanistan or like win Iraq, although it is never clearly defined, you know, what that would have looked like. At no point, you know, all these guys, like Pete Hegseth has this book, The War on Warriors, about how, you know, like we were too constrained by legal niceties around civilian death, and that, you know, we could have won, never defined, the war on terror if we'd been unleashed and we'd let the boys fight, you know, the way they ought to fight without this sort of like legal accountability, which I don't know. The rest of the world might not think that the U.S. was held, or U.S. forces were held accountable for atrocities in Iraq and Afghanistan. But the main claim of, you know, Hegseth's most recent book from 2024 is that that was in fact the case. And so so that's one stabbed in the back sort of narrative that, like, you know, we could have won those wars, again, that isn't defined, if only like our boys had been unleashed to kill however many civilians they wanted, do whatever they wanted. Then there's the other narrative that this is sort of meshed with which is this much longer sort of technocratic narrative. This idea that technology can fix, at root is this assumption that technology can fix like social and political problems, that you don't have to do strategic work, that you don't have to do political work, you don't have to do diplomacy. And it's that, you know, if only we'd had the right kinds of high-tech precision weapons, we'd allowed them to be tested, we could have won the war on terror. And so this is the part of the narrative that's driving this you know, interest in reforming the defense industrial base. And that's not to say that American, you know, industry hasn't declined, that the defense industrial base hasn't declined, that the Defense Department, I mean, it doesn't have issues, that the primes don't have issues. They have longstanding issues stemming from especially like the 70s and 80s. And I can talk about the history of that and sort of their aftermath. It's like these are long-term institutions. But yeah, so like this second narrative that like if only we'd had better weapons, we could have won is sort of what's taken up by this new defense tech sect to say, you know, like we could do the things the primes do better and we should replace them. In reality, I think they're not so much, you know, actually offering to replace the primes. They would like their own sinecures within sort of like defense money. And we can talk about why that is. I think maybe it's intuitive, but framing of the primes versus these new defense tech firms is a little bit like misleading and sort of this theater that's being put on for media, when in fact what the most likely outcome is that defense tech firms will have their own sinecures in certain parts, you know, eat away at the edges of what primes do, and that like they'll find an equilibrium.
But there is a real sort of enemy for these people. On the screen, we've got two sort of major figures in this kind of industrial, what they call the Defense Reformation, which is a very interesting term, right? It comes from, of course, the Reformation of Protestantism. Shyam Sankar and Alex Karp. Alex Karp is the CEO of Palantir, wrote a book called The Technological Republic. And Shyam Sankar is Palantir's CTO, Chief Technology Officer. What does Palantir actually do?
So that is subject to a lot of speculation. And they, you know, intentionally cultivate this sense of mystique around what they do. They like, you know, are very closely guarded about what it is that their products do. But as far as I can tell from reading, you know, as much coverage as out there, is it seems like it's pretty standard data analytics. So they're able to like create databases, create tools to make sense of large amounts of data, integrate data from various sources. But it doesn't seem like it's any, tech that is something that another firm couldn't replicate. There's nothing special about it. It seems like they spread a bunch of rumors about the quality of their technology. That's what it appears. That like they had something to do with finding Osama bin Laden and with taking down this Chinese spy network. Andrew Cockburn writes about this in his Harper piece, but it's also in there's some great BuzzFeed coverage from when they were more of a real news outlet from the 2010s about some of this. And apparently the CIA started getting like upset with them about these inflated claims. But yeah, so I think what they do is like kind of bog standard data analytics. And right. Like, I'm sure it's good, but it's not like better than anything else. I think a lot of the way that they seem, from what I've, gathered in my research, a lot of the way that they get business now is by lock-in, right? So that you have this whole system, you have people trained, all your data's in it. Maybe it's hard to export because they've, transformed it in a certain way, so that seems to be their real staying power and their political relationships.
So they ingest huge amounts of data from all over the government, lots of different kind of data sources. You have presumably the kind of the database of people who are legally in the US. You have, this is what I'm thinking about with a technology that's become very prominent in the last few, even sort of weeks, which is the thing called Immigration OS, which is one of their platforms they use and has been used in Minneapolis, right, in Operation Metro Surge, which is the ongoing operation in Minneapolis, yeah.
And I see you have Elite there too. I think those are similar.
Yeah.
But basically, they're getting more data from more places. There used to be sort of firewall, like legally there are supposed to be firewalls between the collection of data for specific purposes, right? Like if you give your data to the IRS in order to pay your taxes, that's supposed to be legally like separate from the data that, is related to your immigration status. And like, it shouldn't be that these things are fungible, but the Trump administration has allowed Palantir to centralize more of this data in a way that's like, my understanding is dubiously legal. And so yeah.
So I guess across the board, there are these kinds of constitutional protections. There are these ways of preventing, as you're saying, different parts of the US state from talking to each other because you don't want a single integrated surveillance state, right? That was a definite purpose of lots of the kind of, the constitutional protections of the US. But if you use a private company in order to do that, then you can circumvent some of those protections.
Well, I mean, I'm not a lawyer. It seems to me like some of what's happening might not be super legal. It doesn't have to do so much with the contracting piece. Although I will say the third party purchasing of data from, ad tech firms or Thomson Reuters, that is a way of skirting around sort of legal protections, like in terms of, purchasing location data. So that's another way in which they're sort of cobbling together a surveillance state where that's not the intent of like legislation around, government privacy and data laws.
Sorry to interrupt this interview, but I wanted to say something that has come up in some of the comments on the previous video with Jason Moore. In the first question, I referred to a report by Consumer Reports. It's an American website that tests particular foodstuffs for harmful chemicals. And what they said in their report was that a bunch of different meal replacement drinks contain lead. And that's true, they do. But the level they were using in order to establish whether or not that was harmful was based on a thing called Proposition 65, which is a piece of legislation in California that sets a level of lead consumption that is way, 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 way lower than the equivalent level in the EU or the UK or anywhere else. So they're being really overcautious in California about lead in the food supply. And so based on that metric, these meal replacement things are dangerous. But based on perhaps better established, perhaps better understood metrics that you might find in the EU or the UK. These things are not over those metrics. In fact, they're significantly below the dangerous level. Why is that important to tell you? Not because anyone's got in contact with us to demand that we issue some sort of retraction, but because this show, the whole idea of it, is that we are out there on the internet doing our own research. That interview with Jason Moore was recorded back in October last year, 2025, just after the Consumer Reports piece came out. And there's been much more research after that point. This is the thing about doing your own research. It doesn't stop, right? Every time that there's a claim, it has to be tested and keep being tested. So I want you to know that we are committed to owning up to our mistakes, owning up to things we've said that are inaccurate, or in this case, simply misleading, so that even though we are going off on the internet and collecting source of information that aren't the traditional media, aren't this kind of hyper fact-checked, blue-check Twitter kind of style, we are still trying to be accurate. And now, back to Susannah Glickman. So we have these defense primes, these massive contractors that are now supposedly being disrupted by the Andurils, who make drones, Palantir, who do sort of software and data integration for military intelligence and so on, both on the battlefield and also more sort of widely, and also are involved in the NHS. Slightly scary thought. These people are supposedly being displaced. What do defense primes actually make? What do they do? What is their model?
Yeah, so, I mean, this term is, again, a term of art. It's an actor category. It comes from these guys, that this term, the primes. But historically, there had been a U.S. defense industrial base. We had had, like, big, because air power was a big part of winning World War II, the aerospace industry was overrepresented. So, like, Lockheed, Martin Marietta, a lot of, Northrop, they all started out as aerospace companies. And, they focused on airplanes, right? Air power. Eventually, what happens is as the defense industry, has all this financial turmoil, they buy up, different parts of the ecosystem so that they can provide like different services within, besides just aerospace. They roll up the defense wings of, all these other companies. They gain all these other capacities to do different parts, pieces of the supply chain, other kinds of weapons. They adapt a lot to what the U.S. military is asking them to do because those are their primary, customers. So, if the U.S. military is fighting a war, imagining fighting a war in Europe against the Soviet Union, the kinds of things that they produce will, be of a certain type. If it's like the war on terror, like this sort of imagination of, an insurgent enemy, right? That kind of material, again, will look quite different, and these companies adapt. And, in the 90s, what happens is they roll up a ton of companies. They started rolling up some companies in the 80s. They roll up a ton of companies in the 90s. So they basically function not so much as primarily like manufacturers, but as system integrators. The way that actually tech companies work now, where they used to be you had chip companies that were producing chips. Now you have, Apple that's integrating all these other systems into one system. It's very much like that in the defense industry. So now, like Boeing, Northrop, Lockheed, a lot of what they do is this system integration, where they take lots of little parts from other, either subcontractors or parts of the stuff that they have in-house, and they integrate it into whatever weapons or services. Increasingly, like a lot of these big primes got into services during the war on terror, like enhanced interrogation and then humanitarian services, all sorts of stuff like that. But yeah, so at the end of the day, system integrators for the production of different goods and services that the military requires.
And we're talking like F-35s, we're talking battleships, aircraft carriers, like mostly big pieces of equipment. And then in the forever wars, there's a turn towards counterinsurgency material. So that's more like armored personnel carriers and that kind of thing? Or is that like not a kind of is there not such a sudden stark change between these two different modes?
I think there are like different emphases, but these are such long-term contracts, and these companies really try to adapt. I mean, for periods, right, they're also like, oh, we'll provide like, they try to get into software. They try to get into all the kinds of things that the U.S. government needs. I think there is like, a lag, right, in adaptation. So now, these defense tech companies are saying, well, we really need to be able to produce small, cheap drones in a way that the defense primes can't. We really need to rely on software more, and that's our expertise and not their expertise. You should pay us. So they're making that claim. I think basically the U.S. military still very much needs to produce ships, submarines. I mean, there's a huge shipbuilding effort. For some reason, Heritage has gotten really excited about shipbuilding, and I don't totally know why. But those are being handled by
Heritage,
the Heritage Foundation. I don't know why. They're anti-industrial policy on so many other things, but for some reason, shipbuilding, they're just like, I want someone to write that. How did they get so excited about shipbuilding? But they love it.
I guess the idea is that there is this kind of, what you called the Gingrich Republicans, right, who are in general very anti the state being involved in private industry, very sort of state minimalist to some extent. The US defense sector is that exception, right? It's the place where you can actually do industrial policy. To what extent is there actually a coherent industrial policy in the US for the military?
Oh, that's a great question. That's one that scholars debate like quite a bit. But there's definitely like a series. So the coherent is the key word in what you're saying. And so I think there's less of a coherent industrial policy than there used to be. But what there is strung through and sort of hidden all of these different agencies, tax breaks, trade policies, and whether all of these different pieces of industrial policy are more or less coordinated, seems to have to do with like different administrations and bureaucratic conditions. But I would say it's a pretty decentralized industrial policy since like the war on terror. I think because Rumsfeld basically after 9/11 said to the intel agencies and to the Defense Department, do whatever you want on industrial policy.
And so do whatever you want in this context means like spend as much money as you want, or what does it mean in terms of?
I mean, like you develop your own priorities. Like I'm giving you free reign to, make yourself however you would like. I mean, there was original push, right, to contract things. I mean, even Gingrich, right? In 1985, he writes that book Window of Opportunity about how we're going to do all this high tech industrial policy, and then he becomes the champion, the anti-industrial policy champion in the 90s. These guys are always all over the map, and it like depends on who's. Okay, this is cynical. It seems to depend on who's paying them what. And I imagine that Heritage interest in shipbuilding, if I had to take a wild guess, it's not substantiated, but my guess is that it has to do with like, political economy of donors.
Someone's giving them money to say it.
If gun to my head, I have to pick a cause, things are always overdetermined, but I have to imagine that played a role.
This is obviously a famous part of the Iraq War, certainly. Halliburton, where Dick Cheney is, I think, an executive at one point. He then leaves Halliburton to become, I think, a senator, and then a senator before he goes to being the vice president. And then, lo and behold, in the Iraq War, who wins, I say, like no one else was allowed to bid for it.
Right.
Who wins a massive contract for the rebuilding of Iraq? Oh, Halliburton, right? And there is this kind of very straightforward, almost like, connection between these two different parts of the Americans, the American state and private interests. Is that coming apart, do you think? Or are we just like, is there just like a different collection of people with a similar sort of like strategies?
Private equity executive or ex-executive Cerberus, Steve Feinberg, is the Deputy Secretary of Defense for Acquisitions. Or he's just Deputy Secretary of Defense, which has a lot to do with determining acquisition policy, just like, what the Pentagon buys. He, I think it's just a different patronage network. Like, it seems to me that he is just rewarding his friends and allies and investments instead of...
Dan Kane, the current joint chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, is a former venture capitalist, right? Which is an extraordinary thing to have as your head of your army.
I mean, so there is this really interesting phenomenon that begins happening, I think, in the Obama era, but I have to look back at my notes because this is something that I wanted to write about, where all of these military guys, you can't make a ton of money in the military. So what they do is they'll take rotations, like when they retire, it becomes an increasing practice to take a stint as at a VC firm, especially as, the political economy of Silicon Valley begins to turn toward defense. They become much more interested. There's efforts go both ways, right? Under the Obama administration, there are efforts to bring tech in. At the same time, the tech ecosystem is feeling nervous about some of their investments, so they're interested in defense in that way. And yeah, you get this circulation of military guys into VC firms and then back into the military, which I think is also part of how these linkages. But that's it seems like that's increasingly common. And it means instead of it means that patronage, within the defense industry, the Defense Department now goes in different directions. And I think, a lot of what, the Office of Strategic Capital is doing with these investments in this new form of state capitalism that I think they think is modeled after the Chinese, but isn't at all, where they're taking equity stakes in different companies or building pots of money for themselves by taking a percentage of NVIDIA sales of X chip to China. Yeah, a lot of what they're doing is building new patronage networks to reward their networks, in much the same way that the defense industry did, under Bush.
I'm afraid you've outed yourself as a woke liberal there, because you called it the Department of Defense, but it is in fact called the Department of War.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
It's so hard to make the transition. Yeah.
Well, I mean, maybe for you, but for those of us who truly believe in the project, maybe it's easier. You mentioned that the question of sort of learning from China. China is obviously the adversary of the moment. Not perhaps explicitly, but kind of implicitly, it's the other major economy in the world.
Yeah.
What are they trying to learn from China? Because one of the amazing things that, I mean, in this Shaiman Sankar, to go back to him for a second, the CTO of Palantir, one of the amazing things he says is that there is, in the Department of Defense, as it was, there is in fact a kind of communism taking place. What does he mean by that? And what are people actually trying to learn from China, which seems to be much better at industrial production than the Americans are?
Yeah, I mean, none of these guys are internally coherent, but what he means by saying the Department of Defense is communist is that it's non-market, right? That they still have an industrial policy. They still do a lot of things in-house, that there isn't the same kind of competition as he imagines there is in Silicon Valley, which again, we can talk about ways in which that's not true. I think, there is this sense looking at China that they really have figured something out. The way in which Chinese companies have exploded and Chinese production has exploded over the past couple years to compete, especially in high-tech industries, I think has freaked a lot of these guys out. And so, they look to China. It's hard not to see China as a model in some ways. Maybe American, it's not that different from how in the 1980s when American capitalism was floundering vis-a-vis the Japanese, everyone was looking to learn from the Japanese model. And so the US various politicians tried to set up their own version of Japan's industrial policy arm, MIDI. This is similar, but it actually what's fun about this is they don't bother to read about how China works. They don't bother to understand, to try to understand, what's actually going on there, which seems to be very robust competition. There is state guidance, there's disciplining capital, which these guys are not interested in learning about. Right? They're not interested in the Chinese state disciplines capital really well. We should bring that to the US. That's not a part of their equation, right? There's very robust regional and local competition. There's a lot of really innovative financing going on, like sort of like localities. I'm cribbing off the work of people who I've read, so it's not my expertise, but like, there have been ways in which localities figure out how to like print money in various ways, tons of long-term investment. That's not what they take from it. What they take from it is authoritarian top-down picking winners and losers. That's what they think the Chinese model is. They're like, this is basically what I do in my private equity firm or in my VC firm. Let's bring this into government. It works in China. It'll work here. And again, it's nothing to do with why China has these successful companies, but that they're sort of reading what they would like to see into that and, creating an excuse for them to, exercise more control over U.S. industrial policy and, incidentally, subsidies for companies that they have financial interest in.
Just to go back to the Alex Karp critique of the primes, right? Or indeed Alex Karp, in that book I mentioned before, The Technological Republic, his main ire is actually not with the primes, it's with sort of frivolous consumer apps, right? So made in Silicon Valley, the kind of ads tech things. But I mean, as you're just pointing out, that is actually the data that comes from those consumer apps that tells you where people are, at what time, enables you to do what's called pattern of life analysis, which is a particular kind of surveillance technique or a way of aggregating information about a person so that you can find them or attack them or, in the case of the drone war, shoot them.
Yeah.
Those things are central, right? The consumer tech stuff is central to the practice of the national security state, right? Like, it's not like they're sort of separate or frivolous things even. Absolutely.
Not only that, I saw like, a grant call out for, from the federal government to adapt new existing ad tech technologies to like the effort to create like this ICE surveillance state. So they definitely have this dual purpose. They're being adapted in this way. Alex Karp critique that, all of this, all of the brightest minds, all of the sort of U.S. technological prowess was being funneled toward like, I think it's feminized in their mind, like ad tech and sort of, frivolous ways of, fleecing consumers instead of like, I don't know, real material for fighting wars or, building power. Although, again, like you're pointing out to the ways in which these things are these are silly distinctions. Yeah, I mean, like that is the core of his critique. And it seems like, for some audiences, it's been very effective. Like there seems to be this new willingness among tech executives who previously had been unwilling to work with the Defense Department, Like like exactly where you have, you've zoomed in. All three of those companies now proudly work with the federal government and with the Defense Department.
I should say, for people who are just listening to this is both a podcast and a video thing. So if you're just listening to this, the companies on screen are Google, Amazon, and Microsoft. And thank you to Google for hosting this video on YouTube, and thank you to Google Cloud for hosting the podcast backend where you're also listening to this. So maybe our criticism is hypocritical or kind of muted. But I do want to talk about Amazon a bit, because Amazon is not a frivolous ad tech business. It is probably the most powerful logistical network, second perhaps to the US military itself, that the world has ever seen. Todd Lyons, who is the ICE director, said that what he wanted to construct with ICE was what he described as something like Amazon Prime, but with human beings, right? Which is like despicable. Like it's so viscerally 2026, or 2025 even when he said it. How do you understand the kind of the ways in which what we think of as core state capacities, like really hard, I am going to come to your house and arrest you, put you in a jail, and fly you back to another country? Like, how are even those capacities becoming integrated with or finding inspiration with the industries of the 2010s, 2020s, which were, digital, supposedly liberal, had their kind of like, liberal Silicon Valley, Californian ideas? How do you see that sort of integration going on?
I think it's less of a break than maybe it seems. I think for a long time, a lot of these tech companies were happy to like Apple famously has had several disputes with the federal government about handing over information. I'm working with the federal government on certain things, but it does seem like, that many of these other companies were working with the federal government in a quieter way. And what's changed is more like the rhetoric and the way that they're willing to portray themselves. But yeah, I think like there is this real effort in the Trump administration to harness the tech sector toward their various ends, which sometimes are contradictory, but in terms of like, building this surveillance, sort of deportation state seems, very coherent. Yeah, it's horrifying. I mean, that ICE quote I put in the New York Review piece I wrote because I just it's very to the point. It's very succinct.
Yeah, it's like, oh yeah, that is the operating logic of both these things.
Yeah.
One of the dynamics of the tech sector in the last few years has been what Cory Doctorow calls Enshittification, right? The process by which you take a sort of vendor. There are these monopolistic vendors, for example, Facebook is the kind of really obvious one. You get people addicted to it or attached to it in some sort of way, and then you make the product worse for the users, but better for the advertisers, right? Which means more ads, more slop, more sort of, dreadful content that you don't really care about, but that you'll sort of find compelling in a kind of almost animalistic or kind of lizard brain kind of way, right?
Yeah,
where you become impossible to...
Yeah,
we are locked in, right? So vendor lock-in. And you can't leave, but the product becomes significantly worse. Do you think that's happening? Do you think that's happening with, for example, the US government's relationship with Palantir? Did it happen with the US government's relationship with, for example, the primes? Did the quality of weaponry actually just become worse, or did it become just more expensive?
Yeah, so the question of defense procurement is one that has plagued US planners since, I'm a 20th century historian, and so some 19th century historian is probably going to correct me on this, but since at least like World War II, like how to do it right. There is always some imagined golden age where it was very easy, and then things have declined since then. I think, it is very much the case that the defense industry has been in crisis. Maybe we'll get into my sort of periodization of the Cold War. But since the decline of that original Cold War state that emerged out of World War II in the 1970s, that's when all these defense companies started experiencing crisis, much like the rest of the U.S. industrial base, right? Like there's so much, to do with like the decline of labor in the 60s. Offshoring begins then. The 70s, there's a real crisis of this like industrial state. And that state begins to fall apart. Lockheed has this famous bank, there's the end of the Vietnam War and the winding down of, there's this attempt to wind down military Keynesianism, and defense companies suffer. There are all these like big regional recessions in areas that produce primarily for defense, which is like North and South California, Massachusetts, but a bunch of other places. And then there's a moment where, and it like really changes US politics, because industrial policy has happened in the US largely via defense. And so it is like all of these regional economic engines and national economic engines that get sort of like that when planners are thinking about switching, that's the really difficult part, is because there's like, it induces massive unemployment. There's like injections of money that are no longer flowing through whatever. And so in the 1980s, Reagan gets into office, inaugurates like people don't associate him with this, but like an entirely different industrial policy. There's a defense buildup until 85, but recall that Congress is still controlled by Democrats. There's a lot of pressure to hold defense companies accountable, to reduce their profits, and defense starts being like a less and less profitable business. There's also the unleashing of these kind of vulture capital outfits, like we know them today as private equity, but in the 1980s, we knew them as like corporate raiders, and so they go after these big defense firms. A lot of normal companies like GE that had defense wings decide it's time to spin them off, sell them. And so there's this consolidation of the industry and degradation of, sort of profit-making ability and the conditions for the industry that begins in the 80s. I think there is some anticipation that things might change with the Soviet Union, but no one's anticipating the quick collapse that happens in 89. And then there's all this pressure through, Bush and Clinton to shrink the defense industry.
We're talking Bush 1, that, right?
Yeah, Bush 1. It happens very quickly. And so a couple firms basically end up rolling up the entire industry. I mean, there's some concern at the time that like the US state might, nationalize certain parts of the defense industry. I don't know how realistic those were. I'm trying to like figure that out in my research. But what you have are these really fast roll-ups of like this massive industry. A lot of it dies, but a lot of it gets rolled up. And companies like Lockheed Martin end up with this huge sprawling empire. And if you'd had all these like little companies and all these other suppliers learning how to run and integrate this massive new set of capabilities, expectations is actually really difficult. They don't have a ton of time to do it. Meanwhile, like defense industrial policy, the spigot's sort of turning off and the mechanisms are changing in such a way that like they feel very vulnerable. And there's all this institutional experimentation, which is part of where Palantir and then come up. But it also means that the big defense companies that are left aren't functioning in the way that they did when they were more and they were less consolidated and they sort of understood how the different parts of their empire worked, and so more effective management. There's a way in which scaling up that quickly created a lot of problems. And then all of a sudden, right, like the Bush 2 administration comes in thinking they're going to decline defense spending, kind of continue in this general trend. This anti-statist push that comes from like the Gingrich Republicans to shrink the state also applies to defense, but sort of had been stalled for a little bit for various reasons I can get into. Then all of a sudden 9/11 happens, the orientation completely shifts, right? There's like a bonanza of defense funding. And all of a sudden these big primes have to produce a lot. They have a ton of new funding. There's some like small smatterings of industrial policy. And again, some institutions that have been set up in that period, like in QTEL. But I think they're in a very difficult position from which they've never really recovered. Like they've never really become companies that could function the way that that they could, in the 20th century. And so there's so many, it's super overdetermined. There's plenty of other reasons, like there's plenty of graft, right? There's lots of, like I talk in the New York Review piece about exactly how they make sure they get paid out. And that's sort of a constant.
What is military Keynesianism?
Yeah, well, first of all, I don't think we've left it at all. I think like the U.S. economy is very much still driven by like defense industrial spending. But military Keynesianism is just like an economic system where, the sort of economic engine and a lot of redistribution happens through military spending. So like with the state, you could have a Keynesian state where the state spends money on like civilian infrastructure and like healthcare and a welfare state. But under military Keynesianism, a lot of that, big spending, big state, big investment happens through military spending and military institutions. And I think that we really haven't left that paradigm. I think, military spending is still the biggest part of U.S. industrial planning and spending. And like the most money that the U.S. government spends anyway. The defense appropriations chair in the House is one of the most powerful people in Congress for that reason. That said, the nature of military Keynesianism has shifted significantly from the Cold War era, and like what industrial policy looks like, what sort of the government industry relationship looks like is quite different. But I think we're very much in that paradigm. There are all these experimental institutions that are meant to replace certain like functions of the big, military Keynesian state that existed in World War II and in the Cold War. And none of them quite do it, right? Like In-Q-Tel is not the equivalent of, a lot of what existed before. But my sense is that a lot of, like the weakening of like the DoD oversight and planning, and then also, the huge transformation these companies had gone through over the past couple of years. I mean, they also really diversified. I think they weren't sure, right, where things were going. They diversified during the war on terror into, during the Bush administration into like torture, right? Or what is it? Enhanced interrogation, whatever you want to call it. And then in the, Obama era, they seemed to take on like certain more like humanitarian, more traditional contractor. So they're constantly like, rejiggering what it is that they do and expanding into new areas. But it's like super overdetermined that they're somewhat dysfunctional. And then some of it's overblown, right? Like I think the F-35 actually seems to, I mean, I'm not an expert in this, but it seems to work fine. It took
flies.
like, and like basically work. I mean, they wanted like this, the whole idea of what it was supposed to be also was kind of insane. Like this computer, this massive computer in the skies that was supposed to integrate with all these other systems. It's sort of like what was being asked for seemed kind of insane too.
This is what they call network-centric warfare, right? In which you have this network of sensors and arrays and different platforms that are all able to talk to each other and that are able to sort of coordinate strikes in a sort of relatively autonomous way in a kind of network. You get this, is it Rumsfeld who has this quote, who's like, the enemy is a network, right? You need a network to defeat a network.
He was a big proponent of that. This is a long-standing thing also. Like, this is the Pentagon planners hoping that they can solve political and material problems with, like, technological solutions again. Where, like, it's from Vietnam where they think that you can do... you can do this thing that they call the electronic battlefield and then kind of have command and control, centralized control at a distance using all the same kinds of technologies that we associate with, high-tech warfare today. So like remote surveillance, sensors, precision drone strikes, this focus on efficiency. These all go back to the Vietnam era. And after Vietnam, there is some prominent failures and they're somewhat discredited. But with the advance of the tech industry and the apparent success of this kind of warfare in the Gulf War, it becomes, even more a part of U.S. military strategy. So you're totally right in the sense that, and Rumsfeld's a huge proponent of this. He doubles down on this during his period as his second run as defense secretary under Bush. And there is this vision of networked warfare. I think more recently there's been some pushback on that because it doesn't, it's sort of this high-tech fantasy. It doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense strategically. Like, do you really want all those vulnerabilities? If everything's linked together, you just need one weak link. Like, there's all sorts of ways in which that vision doesn't make a lot of sense, but it is kind of this fantasy of like, what if we didn't have to deal with the material realities of war? What if we didn't have to deal with the political realities of war and we could automate it? Which is never, right, that's never going to solve your political or diplomatic issues. But there is a sense in which what the military asks of their contractors and of tech companies becomes more geared around this high-tech warfare vision, which may counterintuitively actually like really degrade the ability of the U.S. military to be successful and get the kinds of goods and services, or like design itself in a way that, for success.
Yeah, we have this sort of...
Not that I'm in the business of giving the U.S. tips on how to be a more lethal fighting force.
I should say, I mean, the whole conversation is in some ways like kind of really... I find myself very strangely positioned on this because I want to be like, you're doing this the wrong way. And yet I also, I don't want the US military to have any capacities. So my zero is good for me as an investment strategy.
Yeah. I mean, it's a weird place to be, right? Because, on the one hand, I've been a long-standing critic of the national security state. And
yet you are now a US defense sector lobbyist.
Yeah. No, exactly. But now,
Tell us about
you're
that.
like, well, is it good? Well, I'll tell you that you have to ask yourself, like, is it good that the Silicon Valley guys are sort of stripping the copper wire out of the walls of the Pentagon, or is it bad? I don't,
Yep.
is it good? Is this the right way? Is this the way you'd want the national security state to sort of be disciplined or not, less disciplined? I don't know. Yeah. So for you're referring to the research I'm conducting for my second book?
Let's call it that if you want. So you are now, I think, legally speaking, a member of the defense lobby through your university. How is that going? How did you become? How did you flip to the other side? And what have you been doing? And like, what events have you been attending?
Well, so I noticed that my university was a member of the NDIA, which is the National Defense Lobby, and that therefore I can like just get all the benefits for like all their publications and invitations to their events by like signing up. And I'd met some NDIA folks. So basically, I'm mid writing my first book. My second book, I'm very interested in like the military industrial complex or the defense industrial base or whatever you want to call it. So I've begun sort of doing interviews for that because this is the right time as these institutions are being really shook up and like all these consensuses are breaking and people are being thrown around. I thought this would be like a good time to talk to people. And so I did. So someone was like, "Oh, you should just join and then go to all the conferences and events." So I clicked a button and now I'm a member. And I've been going. The first event, I'm gonna go to more, but the first event I went to was this drone show at a base in North Dakota. It was very interesting, like this little conference to show off, different drone capabilities. And market it right as like North Dakota as the testing grounds for drones and, specifically this military base and this network of people. And then also, that drones are the future of warfare and that the U.S., trying to get the U.S. military to spend lots of money on drones. The huge Reaper drones have been a fixture of U.S. military gear for like since the Bush era, I think, maybe even earlier. I'm not super familiar with that history. And those have been written about extensively. So what's happened more recently is the emergence of the small to medium drone market. And basically, they're like a cell phone that you attach to like a motor and you fly, right? They're not necessarily super sophisticated, but they are now being touted as the future of warfare. And that is the product of two different things, the Gaza war, if you want to call it that, and the Ukraine war, where drones have occupied a more important role than they had, these small to medium drones, than they had in previous conflicts. Now, this has been spun up. And, there's been a lot of very expensive lobbying to this end and a lot of PR campaigns about, like asking the U.S. military to spend tons of money procuring drones with the idea that this is the future of warfare. In the NDAA for last year, which is the Defense Appropriations Bill, there was something like $200 billion. And you'll notice that you've recently or you might have noticed that there are lots of like puff pieces about Anduril, like the future of like drone tech or anti-drone tech, about the Ukraine war that are really about drones, about the U.S. military not being ready to fight China because they don't have the right drones. The New York Times, there was that 6-piece. They're all very credulous that like drones are the future, that you'll be able to fight these wars with only drones. And I think that's somewhat overblown. I mean, what I've heard, and again, there's no way to verify this, right, is that this is a way of hedging. I think some investors are feeling, and some big investors are feeling very anxious about their bets in AI. And the drone market, making this into the next bubble, is a way of hedging those investments. So there's $200 billion in the last NDAA. I'm sure there's going to be more in the next NDAA. And the fortunes of companies like Anduril have sort of been constructed around that, like, this is going to be the future of warfare. Yeah, I think there's plenty of room for debate on that point. I don't think the Ukraine war is going to be like other wars. And it also seems like even within the Ukraine war, there's lots of like other things are also very important. But there's a ton of money sloshing around these new unmanned drones, or small and medium drones in general.
This has led to a concept we call, I'm not even sure how to pronounce it because I've only ever seen it written down, attributable warfare. So like, as in, it can be, things can atrophy, things can be blown up. You're not expecting your equipment to survive. Normally, you are trying to make sure that your Reaper drone is not shot out of the air, and certainly that your hundreds of millions of pounds F-35 like comes back to the base safely and so on. You're trying to prevent that from that being blown up. In this case, that's much less of a concern. And I've seen some speculation from people like Shanna Marshall, who's written about the connections between this and venture capitalist funding. Like, why is this mode of warfare useful for VCs? Why is the mode of drone construction sort of like better for their construction, their financial interests?
I mean, for them, it allows them to spin up this. Well, they're within their network, right? Within the Thiel network, there are like lots of little drone and counter UAS companies. So like folks who are selling counter drone capabilities as well as, like Silicon Valley loves to create a problem and sell the answer to that problem as well. So there's both sides happening here. I think it's conducive, it fits in. So it has, there's that piece of it, but it also like fits into the larger project of Silicon Valley. The Silicon Valley defense terms, their larger pitch that like, we can replace the primes if drones replace like these larger, heavier things. Our focus on light manufacturing and software, these, cheaper forms of weaponry that can be more easily replaced. That's our specialty. It fits in with their idea that like software is the future of an industry. It's not totally coherent. They love, they love throwing out these big terms like ontology or
that's a term I love throwing out the term ontology as well. So I can sympathize.
But like to describe their computers, like I don't know. It's just like they love doing this stuff. But basically, like I think that's the idea that it offers like a plausible way in which their expertise could be useful for the Defense Department and could help them secure, like long-term stable funding in that regard.
One of the really striking things about, so we think of the US industrial base, and particularly its defense industrial base, as being absolutely enormous. And yet in the Ukraine war, I think it was the Raytheon CEO who commented that the war had eaten up 13 years worth of Stinger missiles and 5 years worth of javelins, right? And this is only in late 2022. So the war had been going on for about 10 months at that point. A third of the American javelin stockpile depleted, right? Like, why is Ukraine like other wars, and why is Ukraine not like other wars in terms of the kind of things that are required for it, in terms of the number of missiles that are required for it, in terms of the number of drones that are required for it?
Yeah, we can also separate out those two things. So like the US hasn't needed to produce like a lot of 150 millimeter artillery shells for a long time. So that capacity isn't there. Same with a lot of these other things. So they could spin up, one response to the Ukraine war could be, we're going to spin up these manufacturing capabilities to make sure that our traditional defense capabilities are where they should be, if something like this happens again. And, at the beginning of the war, especially because those things were still around, like the artillery shells, this, the leftovers from Soviet military the Soviet military base. The war was fought on much more conventional grounds for a long, long time. And some of the Biden people were skeptical of Silicon Valley, although there's plenty within the Biden camp who weren't, were remarking on this in the early days of the Ukraine war. And once the stockpiles of a lot of those things went down, the reliance on drones reciprocally, increased. It's also the case that the drones have gotten better, like on both sides. Like the Iranian drones, the Shahed drones have gotten better. The Ukrainian drones and drone capacity ability to like spin stuff up has gotten a lot better. But that has a lot to do with like the nature of the battle being, it's like about attrition. And so there aren't like the conventional munitions are harder to get. Conventional, all sorts of weapons and, other material is hard to get. Manpower has been very difficult for both sides, right? Like tons and tons of people have died. And so drones make more sense for this particular conflict. Other conflicts may not look like this, but that is part of what makes it special.
Lucky Palmer has spoken. So Lucky Palmer is the CEO of Anduril. In several interviews, he says things like, we are not in a sort of cultural position to have 1% of our population die in a war on the front line. We are not in a cultural position to do attritional warfare where people are murdered in large numbers, even at the level of the US's participation in World War II, right? Which, compared to most of the other countries, right, it got off relatively lightly, certainly compared to the Russians and the Germans, right, who were 30% of people killed, something like this, right? Enormous numbers. And so do you think that the technological intensity of war is the thing that people are focusing on because there really isn't a cultural appetite to go and die for your country somewhere else in the world?
I mean, I think that's certainly the problem that the post-Vietnam U.S. military has been grappling with. It is a problem of wealthy and stable nations. And so I think that is how the U.S. military has been thinking about it. I don't know. I mean, I don't think there is. I think this is a good thing. I think there isn't an appetite in the U.S. to die in what seem like frivolous foreign engagements. Boots on the ground in Venezuela is incredibly unpopular, or Greenland, and that's a good thing. If there is a war that's much more existential, I mean, you can counter that. I'm not saying this is a good thing, but you can counter that with what's happening in Minnesota, where people do feel an existential threat and feel willing to put their lives on the line to defend themselves. And so I think what the U.S. military has spun up, or what Palmer Luckey is pointing to, is an unwillingness culturally to get involved in frivolous foreign engagements or things that the U.S. really ought not to be involved in terms of, foreign meddling. But I don't, if we're planning for a war, the Pentagon isn't thinking so much. I guess they're not thinking so much about wars that would actually be meaningful and existential to the U.S., where you would actually have a different kind of mobilization and sort of participation culturally.
So in the recent national defense strategy, notably, China played much less of a role than it had done under previous iterations of that document. Do you think, why is that? Do you think it's in part because of this need to focus on wars that are extremely easily winnable, right? Like you take out Nicolas Maduro, maybe you annoy the Europeans and take over Greenland and so on, but you definitely can't have the existential war or indeed the sort of the great power competition with China. Is there a sort of a admission of weakness in the lack of a focus or a lack of aggression towards China?
Yeah, I mean, I'm exploring this question myself. I'm writing this article on the rise and fall of what gets termed the China consensus. That was the U.S., I guess, coming out of Trump 1, maybe starting in Trump 1 or the end of the Obama era, and definitely, had its peak in Biden, that the U.S. was involved in this great power competition with China and that we'd have to confront them and that we should retool our, industrial policy, trade policy, and foreign policy around this eventual confrontation. I think to the extent that bipartisan consensus ever really existed, it was fairly short-lived. I think there are China hawks in the Trump administration, but I also think there's a lot of interests that are much less focused on China. There are some that, like some of the Silicon Valley guys would like to be able to sell to China, as you can see with, Jensen Huang wants to be able to sell NVIDIA chips to China. But then there's also clearly parts of the coalition that are much more focused on different kinds of questions, maybe like what they see as an internal enemy or these like limited incursions. And so I don't know, I guess maybe this is me being an American chauvinist, but I often think that American foreign policy is driven more by domestic policy than by, the realities of, it's sort of a luxury that the U.S. has. But I think, I don't know that, it's like, so yes, I think U.S. empire is declining. Do I think that the posture towards China changing is like reflective of that decline? I disambiguate the two. I just think it has more to do with the internal politics of the Trump coalition not really being built around confronting China, more so than, and like the GOP China hawks not really having a commitment to that in the same way that it seemed like they did under Biden when they could use it as a political cudgel. And I think whenever they can use China as something to fight their political enemies or enrich themselves, they absolutely do that. But there isn't like a commitment, an ideological commitment to countering China among that coalition.
I guess one of the kind of...
Yeah.
Sorry, go on.
No, there may be pockets of it, but they're not clearly the majority.
One of the particularly striking things that you get when you have such incredibly powerful lobbyists, and by lobbyists I mean basically business interests that can determine or control whatever it is that the US state does, is that because they have necessarily globalized businesses, right? Because they have businesses like Jensen Huang, the head of NVIDIA, like Elon Musk, the head of both Tesla and XAI and X and the Boring Company and SpaceX, right? Like all these different business interests.
Yeah.
Some of them require him to have the American military as a defense contractor and therefore take an adversarial position towards China. Some of them require him to sell lots of cars, right, in China. Some of them are about free speech. Some of them are about the national defense or national security state, right? Like there are kind of internal contradictions inside having people who are so wealthy, who are also quite central to the practice of US government. And I think that's almost certainly still going on, despite the fact that Elon Musk no longer has his sort of special government employee role.
Yeah, and also like left, right, whether you're in power or not, can we really imagine like going to like really the way things are internally in the US? To me, I have a hard time wrapping my mind around how we would, how the US would put up sort of a meaningful counter to China under these circumstances. Like there's so much, I don't know. Once some of the internal conflict is resolved, maybe I could imagine that. But I think on another level, these guys have interests all over the place and they construe their interests in very different ways that change over time. Like, remember, there were all these Silicon Valley guys who were freaking out at the end of the Biden administration, that the Biden administration, even though they took China very, very seriously, wasn't taking it seriously enough and that they wanted to support Trump because of that. And, that was clearly a veil for a variety of other problems, right? A variety of other interests. But, they're able to reconstruct their interests differently, but it also is just like there is a real material reality that the U.S. is in a moment of transition with lots of like internal dynamics that would need to be resolved before we can do that kind of big foreign policy move externally. I mean, that's the way I see it. Maybe people could be on other wavelengths, but it seems hard to do something sustained.
I have a very provocative take that I want to pitch to you and have you sort of back at me as a kind of a absurdity, right? Which is that there is a kind of new Cold War emerging, right, between the US and China. And it doesn't really matter what it is that the national defense sort of strategy or what the national security strategy.
It definitely doesn't matter.
Right?
Yeah.
These things are just documents. They're just like, they're PDFs you send to people. It's like a press release, right? It's not actually the core of the strategy or the posture or anything like that. There is a new Cold War emerging. It's not that the US and the Soviet Union is replaying itself with the US and China. It's that it's replaying itself with the positions reversed. So at the end of the Second World War, so the US is the Soviet Union, as it was, and China is now the US. So what are the conditions that define the beginning of the Soviet Union? The US has nuclear weapons. It's also the manufacturing powerhouse of the world. In 1945, the US is more dominant in manufacturing, more dominant in the global economy than it is even in 1990, right? So we think about this kind of unipolar moment, this kind of hyperpower moment of the American 1990s. It's actually not nearly as substantial as it is in 1945. Most of the industrialized world at that time is destroyed, basically, almost completely destroyed. And so that is the Soviet Union doesn't really have a great deal of capacity. Vast numbers of people have died in the war. Lots of it's been destroyed by Operation Barbarossa and so on. Not with the same degree of violence, not with the same degree of destruction. But that is basically the position the American state has got itself into. It's atrophied, right? It's become less powerful in terms of the way it organizes itself. And because it's offshored lots of capacity to China is now the manufacturing hub of the world. It is now the central component of global production in the same way that the US was in 1945. And like to be more specific about it in kind of military terms, the US in 1945 had the atom bomb and the Soviets didn't. Right now, China has this thing called hypersonic missiles, and the US hasn't done a complete test of them. That seems like a maybe insane take. Tell me about why that's sort of a wrong take to have.
Well, I guess I think the US in 1945 had a different set of, I mean, the rest of the world looked very different, right? We're not in a world where like everywhere else has been sort of decimated and it's just China that's sort of has its shit together. And like has industrial capacity. Also China's industrial capacity looks very different than the US's at that point. And like a ton of their industrial capacity is offshoring from China, which is, in part in response to US tariffs, but all sorts of other reasons and other dynamics going on. So I think in that sense, it's different. And I think China's own ambitions, like the US, like Dean Acheson is pretty, I am a student of Anders Stephenson, this like great new left diplomatic historian who I think he just recently published his correspondence with George Kennan in the New Left Review, but he also
sorry, George Kennan is the architecture of the like domino theory.
Yeah, well, of containment. And and he's like a great Cold War statesman. And when you read, when I was taught in that class about like the early Cold War, you read like Dean Acheson basically saying, we built this state in World War II when we finally got the US in this position of like a kind of quasi-hegemon during World War II. We have to come up with a way to kind of keep the US in the world in that way. And this idea of the Cold War fits perfectly into that sort of desire of U.S. planners to occupy this new role. I don't think China has that same, from what I understand, I don't think China has that same orientation. I don't think they have an interest in, in that kind of role. And I don't think that the world, I guess like the rest of the world seems like in a very different place vis-a-vis China. I think, now that the US has revealed itself as such a volatile, difficult new hegemon or like declining hegemon to deal with, I think a lot of like what Europe's doing and a lot of what China's doing is trying to manage this sort of erratic new state. And I also think what's happening internal to the U.S. is significantly different from. But I mean, it's not to say that I don't think that the U.S. and China are going to bump up against each other in ways that resemble a kind of Cold War. But I just think, I'm not sure. I think that framework is encouraged by the way that the U.S. national security state is designed. I just think it's not, and it's something that like felt very possible during the Biden era. I was like very concerned about their eagerness to escalate with China when it seems like, we have to deal with climate, we have to deal with plastics, all these like major crises that you have to cooperate to sort of deal with. I thought maybe things were going in that direction then. I feel less. I mean, it just seems like we're entering into a different renegotiation of what the global order looks like, but I don't think it'll look like a global Cold War exactly.
What will it look like?
I don't totally. Predicting the future is a very, very tough thing.
I think what's exciting about you can hedge your bet. So I will allow you to say like, 30% this, 20% that, 10% this, 15% this.
Sure. Yeah. I think what's so exciting about the present moment is like many things could happen, right? There is this openness, there are these vacuums, there's like all sorts of politics, there's like tons of different causes that one could take up and frame a politics around. What's notable to me is this emptiness at the heart of like, well, what is this international system for? What are the central problems that like different countries have investments in? So it just, because the US is so erratic and quickly, the pace of stuff that the Trump administration doesn't just unsettle, the US, it unsettles the entire system. What that means is, you could get a number of different outcomes. I think you probably get, I read the FT, they're useful. You probably get like more of a multipolar world with like, maybe the dollar is the, clearing currency for like X transactions, but there's like a couple sectors where renminbi is used more often. Sort of global sovereignties are distributed in a different, more piecemeal way. That's my guess. I don't know.
Which is kind of the Mark Carney speech, right?
Yeah,
that was what he was talking about, the mesh.
Yeah, it seems plausible enough to me, like that will be in a period where it's just like there's lots of negotiations between middle powers, as the U.S. declines and like everyone sort of like tries to think about how to press their advantage, in these vacuums, in the U.S. declining. Maybe we'll see an alternative politics emerge that sort of reframe this effort in a different way. I hope so. I can kind of imagine it, but it feels very uncertain. It's felt uncertain since like 2018. It seems like, I know everyone uses that stupid Gramsci quote, but like decline when we're in a period where an order is disintegrating.
Tell us what the Gramsci quote is, and then tell us why it's wrong.
Now is the time of monsters. Like what had been is dissolving. What is to be has yet to stabilize. And now is this period. He says monsters, but you can imagine like it's a lot of experimentation and seeing where boundaries are, like testing the borders of things and like new configurations. That's probably happening like all over the place all the time. Like legal frameworks are much less binding. We've noticed that in the US, but it's also internationally true. I don't know what comes next. There's a way in which like certain features of neoliberalism are like accelerating, or features of the past order are accelerating in ways that like change things. There's ways in which, there's like lots of there's lots of sources of fresh politics that I'm being vague, but it's really hard to know.
Speaking of morbid symptoms, which I think is the literal translation of the Gramsci quote, there is a dimension here of the declining rate of profit, right? And so when we spoke to Jason Moore, he was pretty convinced that the military-industrial complex was going to become much more expansive in the coming years. And part of the reason for that is that there are very few truly productive investments capitalists can make. So they look around the world and they think, okay, well, what am I going to invest in? And it's very difficult to find something that will have a productive return. But the state always has money, right? That is one of the sort of foundational features of states, is that they always have money because they issue their own currency and they're able to back up their claims on economic objects with force. There is a tweet that I often think about, which is that some Bitcoin person says, Bitcoin is backed by cryptography and so on, whereas the US dollar is backed by nothing. And someone replies to this with a picture of the U.S. Navy on some sort of exercise, and it's like, here is the nothing that backs up the U.S. dollar, right? So there is a kind of a backstop of physical violence that becomes that allows states to basically spend as much as they want in some theories of monetary policy. When we're thinking about the end of neoliberalism, right, we often think about that from the left, but Alex Karp, Shaman Sankar, people we've been talking about so far have a critique of what they also think of as a sort of particular moment of kind of wastage of the state. Not sure they often use the word neoliberalism, but sometimes probably do. What do they mean by the end of neoliberalism? And how do you understand what they're trying to do there in terms of the kind of the difficulty of profitability?
Yeah, so the declining rate of profit, I mean, I talked about this in a much more like narrow frame earlier, but like the idea that investors who are trying to hedge their investments in AI, like private equity, VC, are moving into the military industrial complex, and especially the drone boom is a way to hedge their investments. I think that's totally true. I think it's happening maybe like, when you say declining rate of profit, it makes it sound like it's like a global phenomenon in every industry. And I think that's probably not, it's probably more complicated, but it's definitely true of like tech specifically. And like the massive, financial power that like ideas in tech were able to wield through the 2010s, cheap money, all this stuff. And now that does seem to be much more, they seem to be trying to hedge on the drone bubble and, other sort of military industrial pieces and like private equity. There's a reason why private equity has, moved into the Pentagon and is imagining or is like, some of them are stripping the copper wire out of the walls, it seems like, and some of them are, taking steps to, create patronage networks that may or may not actually produce things, who knows. And then there's also like pools of money that are being siphoned away from, congressional oversight and into sort of executive, which all sort of function the same way. I think like that makes sense to me. Then there's the right-wing critique of neoliberalism, which I think they cribbed a lot from the left. I think they saw the popular success of left movements and, their correct critiques of a lot of neoliberal institutions. And, Naomi Klein has that book, Doppelganger. I think that is some of what happened. And they started attacking stock buybacks. They started attacking the neoliberalization of like the defense industrial base. And they started, sounding a little bit like leftists in certain ways, in a way that I think is misleading. In that they, in practice, despite as like nice rhetoric about like, oh, we need to, rein in capital, we need to, put national interests first or public good first, which again for them looks super, super different from what maybe you and I might think of in those terms, but they use the same language. But what they actually do is sort of accelerate neoliberal logics. Like they've accelerated privatization. I don't know. I mean, maybe they like believe they're going to build things. They've destroyed a lot of the institutions to do that. A lot of government capacity. And so, yeah, I guess they have that critique. But I think you're. The other commentator that you mentioned is basically right in that they're trying to secure profits. I just don't think it's as like as theoretically sophisticated as it sounds when people say declining rate of profit. They're like looking like they are, but it's much more crude and much more like crony capital than, and much less like theoretically it's much less theoretically sophisticated or sustainable than it might, if they were, I don't know, more interesting thinkers.
Yeah, I've read the Technological Republic, and it was not perhaps the most interesting book that
it's
I've read all
year. Yeah, I mean, having to listen to these people all the time, you don't get a lot out of listening to them because it's all just this pastiche of like different words that they made up or they heard around and ideas that are sort of like half-baked. Like, I mean, maybe we shouldn't expect this of our business leaders, but I understand, when I read Doppelganger, I was like, I understand her frustration. You've come up with these like real meaningful critiques of the system as it is and imagining other worlds. And then these, right-wingers come in, use a couple buzzwords, and then, because they have, more power to implement it, are able to like co-opt and use those same, the mechanisms that you've been building, the explanations, the power that you've been building in order to transform the state to their own ends that are very short term and very, it's just like looting. I mean, I don't know how to understand it as much more than looting, because it doesn't seem to be any long-term vision or long-term institutions that they're building.
You said that they undermine the structural conditions for their own business. Tell us about that process of undermining.
Well, it's interesting because, I see you've zoomed in on Norm Augenstein and In-Q-Tel, and you're right to point to that as an example of like an attempt at institution building that is much more long-term. I think this new generation, it seems to be much less interested in building long-term funding institutions and long-term planning institutions as much as like awarding their allies contracts. It does seem like pretty uninteresting in that regard. But there was like a lot of this generation are products of institutions like In-Q-Tel that you're pointing to. So In-Q-Tel is very interesting in that basically 1990s, there's the destruction of a lot of like industrial capacities, like the welfare state, a lot of, it's a long tail of what was happening under Reagan. But basically a lot of the industrial policy mechanisms for defense, although not for electronics, there's like a bunch of areas that still receive, a different kind of industrial planning and funding, but still do. But defense is in a kind of tough spot. There's one effort which breeds In-Q-Tel. It's Norm Augenstein, this guy, Gilman Louis, and, the CIA director at the time. They set up this nonprofit, In-Q-Tel, that's tied to the CIA and basically structured in such a way that they can pay they can pay really, really, really well, like private sector levels or better, and that they don't ever have to return money to the Treasury. So they're not subject to the same kind of oversight. Congress can't just get rid of them. And they invest in high-tech businesses. The idea is to make sure that there is some sort of high-tech industrial policy for the intel community and, parts of the defense industry going into the future. Out of In-Q-Tel, they were, they're the for the longest time, they're the funders and shapers of Palantir. So up until 2008, they're the CIA's Palantir's only customer. After that, they try to get into the corporate world. From the BuzzFeed reporting, it seems like it doesn't work out very well, and they lose a lot of those corporate contracts. They go back to relying on the intelligence community, and then more recently, because of their alliance with the right in the Trump administration, they've gotten tons and tons of business, but it seems more on that basis. Anduril, Shield AI, they all come out of In-Q-Tel. There's tons and tons of these new defense tech companies that come out of there. And basically deny that they, portray themselves as though, well, they don't outright deny, but they portray themselves as though they come out of private industry and it's just their success is due to their own genius in some way. And that's clearly not the case.
They're funded by the VC ring of the CIA.
Yeah, for the longest time, and by contracts coming from the intelligence agencies. They've never been untethered from that. Like their profits, they're very reliant on government profit. I mean, government, payments.
Does the technology work?
A lot of this stuff is, kept under wraps and sort of classified. But we can look at specific areas to get a sense of that. So in the war over, defense tech piece that I wrote, I talked a little bit about the drones. The drone technology, and it does seem from available evidence. The Wall Street Journal has had a number of really good pieces about this, but that a lot of these super hyped defense technologies around drones don't work particularly well. The drones and the counter UAS, they're just sort of, there is something, I've talked to Ukrainian drone manufacturers. Things, they're on the ground. They're dealing with they're shaped by the very material realities they're responding to. And there are lots of it is an arms race. So they're if you develop drones that have a certain GPS component or have, someone on the other side is going to try to create a technology that disrupts that, some sort of jammer. And so the Ukrainians on the ground are much more involved in that. And I think US tech companies like Anduril, just showed up, tried out their, and thought they could compete on that basis, but don't seem to be able to produce drones and counter-drone technology that work as well as their Ukrainian counterparts and don't perform on the battlefield. In fact, it seems like, the Ukrainians have a hard time refusing U.S. aid, but have been frustrated with U.S. defense tech deliveries to Ukraine, weapons deliveries to Ukraine. And that's the basis for, I think this specific case, right, it seems like a lot of these overhyped technologies don't work very well. And I think that insight seems to be true in other areas as well, or that the technology that's being overhyped isn't somehow exceptional. Maybe it works, but it isn't something better than another company could create. There aren't these huge moats around these companies. So
Palmer Luckey, who is the head of Anduril, got his start by making a thing called the Oculus, which was then bought by Facebook, as was Meta nowadays, which is a kind of a VR headset, right? And it's mostly used, at least at the beginning, for playing immersive games. If anyone remembers the Half-Life series, rest in peace, there was a game called Half-Life Alyx, which you could only play on a headset. I'm not sure of the Oculus one, but this kind of technology. Having extended reality for your soldiers has been a very long-term project of the US military. It's particularly useful in sort of counterinsurgency situations where you want to be able to see behind walls. And there are now these extraordinary demonstrations. Palmer Luckey went, I think, on the Joe Rogan show to show off this technology, where you
which is where you'd go, right?
Which is exactly where you go, right?
Of course, yeah.
This is kind of the extraordinary thing, right? You don't even have to do a sort of slide deck at the Pentagon anymore. You can just talk to Joe Rogan, and then of course all the people in the administration are so chronically online that they're of course watching that perhaps more attentively than they would be watching this. What can you tell us about Meta's involvement in all of this? Because Meta is in some ways the quintessential sort of liberal or self-presentingly liberal, sort of value-free, kind of pluralist organization of the 2010s. Is that simply a complete illusion?
Well, we've all watched Mark Zuckerberg pivot toward the manosphere. Sure. So clearly they have, they've embraced their role as military contractors. So I guess in that sense, it was, if that's the crux of your question, it was a thin political commitment. I think that political scientist David Karpf writes about how one of the core values of a lot of these Silicon Valley guys is the pivot, around whatever the political situation throws at them. I think, they always were basically happy to work with the military. But the political situation has changed, the labor situation has shifted. AI has been very useful for instilling labor discipline, and so they've felt freer to work with the military. And it does seem from other reporting that I linked to in the piece that the Meta goggles have had some issues, like Microsoft's version as well. I think a lot of these like tech fixes to what are larger strategic or diplomatic issues sort of miss the forest for the trees, and that they're trying to solve this very particular technological problem. None of them are going to, do it, come up with some it's not going to no one's going to reinvent the nuclear bomb where it gave one country stupendous advantage. And again, only for like a couple of years, right? At the base of this is an unwillingness to reimagine military power, like hard power, as one element in a toolbox of what wielding state power looks like. That like diplomacy, political work, soft power have a big role to play in wars of the future as much, economic warfare, whatever. But instead there's this very narrow focus on just, better and better gadgets that will change the nature of warfare, as though your enemies won't also adapt to the same arms race as they have historically over and over and over again, right?
Trump now has declared that because the Norwegian monarch, who does not have control over the Nobel Peace Prize, didn't give him the Nobel Peace Prize, he is now abandoning peace and will now pursue a strict America first agenda. Peace is no longer his main consideration. What can we expect from the wars of the future?
You mean under the Trump administration?
Yeah, under this administration, or if there are sort of longer technological developments that take decades often to kind of realize themselves. One of the interesting things about the sort of the primes in their kind of almost sclerotic nature, their slowness to pivot, is that new weapon systems that are commissioned in 2019 or whatever come online in 2036, right? So there is like a decadal transformation project that has to happen for the US military to be able to fight a new kind of war. What kinds of wars are they now heading towards being able to fight? And what does that mean for international relations?
Yeah, I mean, what do they think they're going to? What do they think they're going to do? I know maybe there is some amount of caution that I should have in saying this, but the Trump administration right now, I mean, it feels like we're they're kind of experimenting with lots of things to try to figure out what is, how is the state working in this new period? What sort of new order are we going to create? I don't think like Trump does so much in such a short period of time and presses so many different buttons that it feels hard to anticipate what he's going to do. It feels hard to anticipate, what there will be an end to this era, and it's not in the particularly long term, and what the next administration will look like and what their defense policy would look like, what their foreign policy, completely unpredictable to me. I have no idea. But in terms of you're asking about the technological piece, what kinds of technologies does the Trump administration think they will need to fight wars of the future? They are pitching this this vision of furthering this vision of electronic warfare that's existed in the U.S. defense establishment. Yeah, really. Coming out of World War II, when you could apply statistics and economics to warfare and imagine efficiency and increased lethality, which often, precision, control. This is a vision, that you could have centralized control. You could automate warfare. You could do warfare at a distance. That's kind of, they aren't breaking from that vision. They're accelerating it. And when they talk about small to medium sized drone warfare and counter drone warfare that will, involve fewer people, robotic warfare. This is, it's in some ways, it's not, the vision of where technology is going, where warfare is going, is not different. Whether it'll actually look like that, I mean, I have my doubts. I think like traditional forms of warfare, you know, where you need artillery and trenches, those probably will endure and will be central. But you're right that they're building, or they're imagining building, a military base that would be able to produce the kinds of technologies, these gadgets, that would be able to pursue this vision of high-tech warfare at a distance. I don't think they're actually building the capabilities for that and like the manufacturing capacity for that. I don't think they're doing that. But two, I don't think that's actually I'm skeptical about whether that's what wars of the future will actually look like. But the fact that they're planning for it and maybe building certain pieces of that infrastructure will affect what future warfare looks like.
The other big, I mean, that sort of, in some ways, is the opposite tendency to the one that we've seen since at least the Obama administration, when there is a massive pivot towards special forces as the main tool of warfare. So in the sort of the return of ISIS, and in sort of the second surge stage of the Iraq war, you get these special forces-led operations, F3 EAD operations, which is something like find, fix, execute. I can't remember exactly what the acronym stands for, but it's a form of warfare that involves collecting huge amounts of information from the battlefield, often from people's notebooks, from hard drives they got in their houses, and then finding all the names in that, and then sending the special forces out to kill those people, and then finding their notebooks, finding their diaries, getting all the names in there, killing all those people as well. And so there's this kind of much more direct, sharp tip of the spear, which is kind of technologically sophisticated, but doesn't rely on these vast platforms. So this idea of war at a distance, it seems like the wars of the future, certainly with, say, the Maduro operation, are in fact wars of like the extreme proximity, maybe technologically mediated, but they are nevertheless wars that get involve very highly trained operatives working in like face-to-face contact with other people.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think those two are necessarily like at odds with each other in the way that you suggest. I mean, right, it is that we're not going to send boots on the ground. We're not going to send tanks and artillery. We're going to send like a couple guys with a ton of gadgets. And that's like the JSOCification of the military, which is something, this focus on assassination, precision, it's like the Israeli model. And I think it's worth asking whether that has worked out for the Israelis. They've been able to, all the things that, Hegseth wants, right? Like unleashed brutality, no legal constraints, high-tech, gadgets that don't have to be tested in ways that, we might normally have expected, right? That can sort of be let rip on the battlefields. These are all things that, Israel's had pretty free rein to do. And I think it's worth asking whether that they've been able to achieve their strategic goals through these methods. I don't know that anyone's asking that question, but I think all of these things are of a piece, and that is like the apotheosis of that vision. And I don't know whether that's like a coherent, I don't know whether that is a vision of the future of a military that will be that successful. Because again, what are wars fought for? Why do you want military power in the first place? What is it that you're trying to accomplish? I think these questions are often left out of the conversation in favor of, this, if we just like add a couple more gadgets, if we like, if we, rely more on assassinate. So what is this? There's no, I find it really frustrating because, like, well, what are we doing this for? What are we building these capabilities for? Doesn't seem super articulated, right? If we were going to go to war with China, something like that would look much more like a traditional, I think, probably more like a traditional war. But what do I know? I mean, I don't,
Okay, on that terrifying note of the Israelification of the American military, we will leave it there. Thank you, Susannah Glickman, for doing your own research.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate it. Yeah.